It is February 13th, 2025, and U.S. President Donald Trump has confirmed that he has had his first official phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, marking the first time that the presidents of the U.S. and Russia have spoken to each other directly in over 3 years. They talked about a variety of topics that go beyond just the war in Ukraine, but it is that conversation about Ukraine that has led Trump to say that there are plans to have direct talks in person, possibly first in Saudi Arabia, but that Trump and Putin have signaled that they do want to visit each other's countries and to talk to each other there. So, yes, it's progress, but don't get too excited because Trump is still at the same time signaling that he plans to continue U.S. military support for Ukraine in this war against Russia. He plans to continue the fight for rare earth minerals in Ukraine, much of which Russia currently controls. And so it's very clear at the moment that this current war is not coming to an end anytime soon. Now, the rhetoric that we are seeing from the Trump administration, though, is very different than what we saw from the Biden administration. I mean, we're seeing a Trump administration that is acknowledging reality in a way that we did not see from Biden, right? You have Trump's defense secretary acknowledging that in order for an agreement to be made, there is not going to be a Ukraine that is pushed back to the pre-2014 borders, acknowledging that NATO can't dangle the promise of membership for Ukraine in Russia's face and expect for there to be a deal. So progress, yes, but still a long ways to go. But we got into all of the latest of what was said and what it means with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here. So, we have US President Trump. He has announced that he and Russian President Putin have held what he described as a lengthy and highly productive phone call where they discussed everything from the war in Ukraine to artificial intelligence. Trump said that they plan to visit each other's countries, but that their first meeting will likely be in Saudi Arabia. Now, this is notably the first time that the presidents of the US and Russia have had a direct conversation in over 3 years. And what I thought was interesting was that you had Trump admitting that Zelensky really is kind of an afterthought here, right? He's not an important member when it comes to the quote unquote peace process for Ukraine. This is the first time we've seen that kind of rhetoric from Trump, because before it was, let's get Zelensky and Putin in a room together and get them to figure it out. So how do you see what Trump's saying and the possible progress we could be making here?
Okay, so it is interesting. I think this was probably the first direct conversation that they have had with each other, probably since Trump's last administration. Right? I know there's been lots of rumors, and Trump's been real coy. If I was talking to him, I probably shouldn't tell you, blah blah blah. But I think this is the way they have reacted to this tends to make me believe that yes, this is the first direct conversation they've had since not only since Trump's inauguration, but probably since the election as well, which I think Putin would rightly be very cautious about, and hopefully Trump's team was cautious, trying to avoid the same kind of Russiagate political hysteria and McCarthyism that happened during Trump's last administration. They apparently had a wide-ranging discussion, and actually the Russian and the U.S. president, there is a lot that they should be talking about other than just Ukraine, right? Ukraine, yes, but also the Middle East and artificial intelligence and energy and all sorts of other things. And the list from, even forget the readout, just Trump's tweet, social media post about what they talked about. It's just like, you're actually shocked that they didn't talk about the results of the Super Bowl and why the Chiefs really should have won. And whose country has the better beer, on top. That's kind of the impression you got away from it. And certainly Zelensky and the leaders in Europe have got to be absolutely horrified and aghast at all of this. And there was an article out in the British press, I want to say the Telegraph, in the last 48 hours. You're probably familiar with the name Roland the Oliphant. It's as unlikely a real name as that is, and it apparently is. He has been a kind of a perennial anti-Russian journalist in the the Anglosphere for many years, and he wrote an article that just came out that was the headline was "This is now Putin and Trump's world," and he was lamenting how the EU and Kiev are just already bystanders, right? They're already they don't factor into. And if it has to be said, if there is, forget peace, forget any type of post Cold War security architecture. Let's just work on U.S. de-escalating its role in the conflict in Ukraine. For that alone, it has Europe and Kiev need to be left on the sidelines. And it appears that the Trump administration has understood that, because most European leaders, right, Viktor Orban, Fico, a couple of others on the side, are still committed to this conflict and will do whatever they can, not only to continue the conflict, but to draw the U.S. into it, even to the point of direct conflict with Russia. Right? They will not give up. There will be false flags. There will be all sorts of things that a desperate Kiev and desperate European leaders are going to try to resort to in the coming weeks and months, because they're not just going to let this go quietly, almost certainly. And they're already whining that there can't possibly be any peace settlement without them there. And let's be clear, Putin and Trump meeting in Saudi Arabia, first summit, it's not going to be any kind of, oh, the conflict is over, let's sign this. No, it will be an initial meeting that will begin very long, hard, and inevitably probably fruitless negotiations. I still don't see that there's any common terms that the U.S. can come to with Russia over this in the long term. Russian terms are too maximalist. They haven't flinched a bit. In fact, they've only gotten stronger since the conflict, and with good reason. They're winning this conflict. And the U.S. is a party to this conflict, and they're on the losing side of this conflict. So the U.S. doesn't get to dictate terms. They don't get to present a peace plan that they give to Russia. Now, that's not the way that this is going to work. And Russia's like, fine, you have no leverage over us, or you may think you do, but you don't. And if you don't give us what we want, what our terms are diplomatically, well, then we'll just continue. And they'll be fine with that. So this is the beginning of a long process, and perhaps the process is at least as important as the outcome, because there is a lot of other issues in the world that require at least the US and Russia working around each other, if not actually with each other, because they are the two largest nuclear armed superpowers. They're two of the 5 largest economies in the world, and the countries with the 2 most powerful militaries in the world. That they've got the last 3 years of no contact at all between the U.S. and Russia, and this attempt to isolate them and contain them has been an absolute aberration that has put a lot of other conflicts and tension spots in the world in a very difficult kind of pause position, because U.S. and Russia, weren't even talking to each other during that time. So whatever else comes from this, and however aghast the Kiev regime and European leaders may be, the fact that the U.S. president and the Russian president are talking again is a significant improvement if you don't want nuclear war. right? It's already a significant improvement of global tensions, even if there is no successful result of a peace process at the end of it. At some level, it is the process that is important.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring that up because it almost kind of seems like in some places in the media, definitely on social media, people have this thought that, okay, Trump and Putin are talking, the war in Ukraine is over, right? Everything's fine. They're going to figure something out and then we're just going to move on. But as you noted there, given the fact that Russia is currently winning, they don't have to have a deal, right? I mean, sure, in theory, some kind of agreement may be nice. It could keep us out of nuclear war, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, Russia's still winning on their end. So they're going to want an agreement that acknowledges that and that is based off of the reality on the
And the
battlefield.
U.S., even Trump, they can never admit that Russia won. They have to have something that they can spin in another way. And if they can't get anything that they can spin in that way, then it's better for them to have nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, good for people to keep in mind instead of just thinking, oh, this is gonna, be tied up in some nice little bow and we're gonna go on our merry way. Now, one thing I did think was interesting is, you compare it to the rhetoric that we heard even from Trump kind of pre-election or coming up to this point where he just was very general about it. We're gonna get Putin and Zelensky to talk and that's gonna be it. Well, now you have Trump's defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, in Europe saying, hey, Ukraine is not going to return to its pre-2014 borders. That's incredibly unrealistic. The Ukraine is
A
not like
recognition of reality.
exactly that Ukraine is not going to join NATO and that when it comes to a possible deal that quote to be clear, as part of any security guarantees, there will not be US troops deployed to Ukraine. Now, these are the kind of basic statements that Russia was practically begging for going back, 3.5 years ago. They were literally telling NATO, hey, we need these guarantees. We need this recognition of reality. And NATO refused to give it to them. Now, I know that the only reason that US officials are saying this is because that's their way of recognizing the reality on the battleground, right? Because Russia's winning, then they're getting to this very easy point of saying, yeah, there's no way we're going to go back to the borders before where they were in 2014. But how do you think that Putin and his government view what they're hearing from the Trump administration right now? And is there some temptation to say, okay, let's believe it, let's make some kind of a deal, even knowing that Trump's only going to be here for 4 years? And even then, it's Donald Trump. So that's not really saying too much.
No, that is not the way that the Kremlin is going to look at this, and they've made that perfectly clear already. They're glad to talk. They're glad to be talking to the U.S. again. What they've heard, particularly in the past 48 hours, have been positive first signals, right? Acknowledging these basic facts of reality is a good place that allows a conversation and negotiations to begin. Before that, the negotiation conversation weren't even possible. Right now, a negotiations can begin, and again, in the end, Russia's demands may be more than the U.S. Can accept. You know, Crimea, Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. Right, not only Ukraine not joining NATO, but no de facto NATO. Right, no Western bases in Ukraine, no weapons for Ukraine, no NATO training for Ukraine, right? No NATO in Ukraine at all, no EU either, right? I mean, all of this is again, it's a good first step. It allows serious talks to actually begin, but it doesn't mean they're going to be able to come to any type of agreement down the road. And there's always the issue of trust, right? And the Russian question all along has been forget Zelensky, right? They don't regard him as legitimate and capable of signing anything, which means that elections have to be held in Ukraine and that will take months and so forth. And who knows if that will result in anyone better under quote, in elections where all the opposition is all the real opposition is outlawed in the country. The parties are banned. And even within the Maidan parties, right? Just in the last 24 hours, Zelensky renewed attempts to seize and arrest Poroshenko, the previous candy oligarch leader of the Kiev regime, whom, as the leader of the European Solidarity Party, another Maidan party, but domestically, if in no real way other than egos and personalities, in opposition, quote, to the Zelensky servant of the people party, right? Even if Zelensky did the exact same thing that Poroshenko did when he was in office, they hate each other for personal and domestic reasons. And Zelensky had previously charged Poroshenko, as he did the leaders of all the major opposition parties in Ukraine, as traitors, right? As having committed treason and not being loyal to the regime. And now he's renewing attempts to arrest Poroshenko. And because now there's talks by Russia, and Trump himself has mentioned now that elections might have to be held in Ukraine. Well, Zelensky immediately goes and tries to find any of his potential opponents and get rid of them now, right? That's what's going on. So you can see where this could be a very long process. Also interesting to note is, where's Kellogg? Because Trump on his social media post listed the people who will be involved in setting up these negotiations. He talked Rubio, he talked Witkoff, he talked Waltz. Kellogg's name is suddenly nowhere to be seen. So Kellogg may be either downgraded or off the diplomatic circuit. Maybe the fact that his daughter is actually in charge of an organization that provides aid to Ukraine, RT Weatherman, maybe that has something to do with a conflict of interest. Not flexible enough, whatever. But it's interesting to note that Kellogg has suddenly disappeared in the last 48 hours. There's no mention being made of him.
Interesting. I did not even realize that. I saw the big long list that he had, and that did not even cross my mind that where is Keith Kellogg? Apparently, he's not there.
So, I mean, first of all, it's nice that Pete Hegseth says Ukraine will never join. Well, actually, what he says, it is not a realistic outcome of a settlement in Ukraine, of a settlement of the conflict, that Ukraine will become part of NATO. That isn't actually a promise that Ukraine will never join NATO, blah, 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 right? So even that, how do you codify that so that Russia can trust it, right? I mean, after the pullout of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, Trump himself out of the Open Skies Treaty, the Short and Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the New START Treaty, the February 21st agreement in Ukraine, both rounds of the Minsk Accords, Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, the Istanbul Communique. How does Russia trust anything that's written, even to last till the end of Trump's presidency, much less any longer than that, right? It's going to be very hard. Negotiations are going to be very tough. And ultimately, I'm not sure if Russia can trust the West any further than it can throw it, Trump included. And that realities will have to be agreed upon only after being made on the ground. So do not necessarily, I would say almost certainly, do not expect a quick resolution of this if there ever really is one. For one thing, it's not just in NATO. It's no NATO bases in Ukraine, no training of NATO troops, no arming of NATO troops, no NATO, no EU, no nothing in Ukraine. I mean, otherwise, what has all of this been for? Right? No stealth Ukraine, no Ukraine as a battle platform against Russia that will rearm. No, none of that can be done. So it's going to be very, very tough negotiations. And then there's a whole host of other issues. The demilitarization, any future size of a Ukrainian military, and the denazification or the debanderization, more properly, I believe it should be called, of Ukraine. That's a whole nother issue. So it's going to be very, very tough talks moving forward. And however Trump may not like Zelensky, have contempt for him, have no respect for him whatsoever, and not be much interested in Ukraine. He's still the U.S. president, and the U.S. has interests in Ukraine, and he can't just walk away and throw everything. Right? He's already being called. The reporters are shouting at him, "Why have you betrayed Ukraine?" and everything. That's going to grow to a fever pitch in the coming days and weeks. Get ready for it, right? It's going to become absolutely hysterical in the
Uh,
United States and within Europe. So these are all positive first steps. The exchange of prisoners, one exchanged on both sides, possibly others that will follow. This is all extremely positive. Just don't expect magic. Um, Negotiations, diplomacy is hard work, and especially with two countries in conflict. And there hasn't been any of it for 3 years. And there's still enormous political forces in the United States and in Europe who are absolutely opposed to any of this happening.
Yeah, I think that's really important to keep in mind. And it's interesting, too, what you were mentioning about the media. It reminded me of the fact that during the presidential debates, right, Trump was being asked, well, don't you want Ukraine to win? And it's like that rhetoric started very early as a reminder that this is how they are going to treat Trump or anyone else who looks at the current situation in Ukraine and goes, okay, what are we doing here, right? There is no quote unquote winning here. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention about the negotiations, because of course, Zelensky's not staying silent. I don't know that he ever has been silent. He's now speaking up and he's offering the remaining territory that Kiev's forces are holding in Russia's Kursk region as a bargaining chip. And the Kremlin has come out and said, absolutely not. That's ridiculous. We're not having that conversation. Now, I did actually have a question submitted by one of my paid subscribers on Patreon specifically for you. Adrian wanted me to ask you. So, Marco Rubio has said that both sides will need to make concessions. What do you think the concessions are that Rubio has in mind for Russia? And are there any concessions that Russia would be willing to accept here?
Yeah, I think the U.S. has all kinds of concessions in mind for like, okay, maybe you get Crimea, but nothing else, right? Or maybe we can agree to not agree on Donbass, but you don't get Kherson or Zaporozhye. Or Ukraine doesn't join NATO, but it joins the EU, and we get to continue to pump Ukraine full of arms and training and turn it into a de facto NATO base anyway. Those are the types of things that they have in mind. And none of that is going to be acceptable to Russia, which is why I say this is going to be a large, very difficult process, and don't necessarily expect a successful outcome at the end of it. With regards to the wider question, Adrian, if we take a look at what Russia might be willing to concede, if you'll remember the initial security guarantee demands that Russia made back at the end of 2021, before they began the special military operation, they were also voicing their opposition to, for instance, U.S. military bases in Poland and Romania with air defense assets that could also actually be missile launchers, with essentially demanding the rollback of NATO forces to Germany as well. Those are things that Russia might be willing to concede, right? But not much more than that. They can discuss how large the Kiev regime, the Ukraine's military is going to be at the end of this. We can discuss what they're going to do internally in Ukraine, right, to hold elections, to allow the ethnic Russian and Russian speaking people of Ukraine to speak their own language. They can discuss the ending of the persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, right? These are things that can be discussed. But once again, you see how long the list of things that have to be met according to Russians' terms. And then we can discuss sanctions, right? I actually think that sanctions relief is probably going to be at the absolute bottom of Russia's priorities because they're doing just fine. I mean, there are some people, right? They can make more money, but as things are going, I think that's much less important than the wider geopolitical issues. So, Trump tossing, we can reconnect you to SWIFT out there is not going to be an acceptable carrot to say, oh, Russia says, oh, well, if you let us back on SWIFT, then we don't want Zaporozhye, right? That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And as for the whole Kursk nonsense, that's absolutely, I mean, they're pouring more and more troops in there just trying to keep that Kursk pocket open. And they're down to basically a little pocket around Suja, probably less than 35% of what they started with. Their supply lines are under constant the one supply road is now under absolute drone bombardment. We want to call it operational control. They are not going to be able to keep the Kursk pocket alive through the course of negotiations, right? And if they did, Russia would never accept any kind of trade in that regard, right? Not when they know they can take it back. Right? There's no question. There's very good reason to believe that the only reason the Kursk pocket is still open today is because Russia decided that it was useful for to attrit and wear away the Kiev regime forces, and also to keep them from putting those forces in what could be more defendable positions in the Donbass, in, say, Pokrovsk or Chasiv Yar or Toretsk or something like that, to keep them fighting out in the open in little tiny hamlets in Kursk was strategically absolutely, suicidal for the Kiev regime. And if they were willing to do that, then Russia was willing to keep firebagging away at the Kiev regime forces. But when it comes down to when there is the possibility sometime in the future of this process, they will close that and just end it. If not in the very near future, Russia has the resources to close Kursk and to close it completely. It's just a matter of prioritizing the resources there instead of, say, Pokrovsk or Chasiv Yar or somewhere else. And right now, the list of other places also keeps getting shorter and shorter. Toretsk has officially been confirmed as being fully taken, finally, in the last week, and several other settlements as well. So the Kiev regime's military situation continues to attrit and get worse. Russia's position continues to get stronger, which is why Kursk is another hopium fantasy deluded emperor with no clothes dream of Zelensky. He's just, I mean, he's also said things like, give us nuclear weapons and give us lots of missiles to fight Russia and all of this other. He's getting desperate, and he senses that things are closing in. And what had been his biggest patron up until now, right, the one that everything depends on, has just been like, yeah, we're not really that interested in you, and personally I don't actually much like you at all. And that leaves them in a very bad position. I expect desperation, expect crazy things, expect false flags and chemical weapons, I expect all kinds of terrorist activity and asymmetric warfare as the desperation level starts to kick up into very high, whiny Zelensky levels.
And expect the media to be right there covering it all, right? Asking, how dare Trump not bring us to World War III to try to...
The media in the West is a political actor, an ideological actor. They are the fourth estate, and they have driven this conflict as much, if not more, than any other branch of the U.S. government for the last 3-4 years.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to me how many comments I get from people that will watch our conversations and they respond and go, I heard none of that in the media, right? I've never heard this before. I thought that Ukraine was doing just fine. And it's like, Yeah, it's very telling when you've got an alternative media, an independent media that is actually having conversations about what the reality of the situation on the ground is and what the reality of these talks are. I mean, that's why I appreciate the fact that as cynical as you are, you also approach this in a realistic way, because you know that, hey, just because we have talks does not mean that everything's going to be fixed, especially given the current conflict, how many years we've been building up to this. And yeah, exactly as you were saying, I mean, there could be some kind of agreement, right? There could be some kind of a guarantee, but what's to guarantee that that guarantee is going to be kept on the Western side? There really is nothing at the moment, especially coming from someone like Trump and with all of his quote unquote friends or not friends in the EU ready to keep supporting Ukraine until the bitter end.
France and Denmark just delivered more fighter jets to Ukraine over the weekend, right? They're useless old Mirage 20s and old F-16s, and the current F-16s haven't done anything for Ukraine, quite obviously, in this conflict. But just keep that in mind, that the Europeans are not at all ready to cash this in, right? I mean, other than Orban and Fitzo, of course.
Yeah, it is going to be an interesting couple of years, especially as we get some sort of U.S.-Russia talks going to see how everyone else responds to it. And I look forward to talking about that with you as we get there. I appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also catch Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.